Greetings, travelers. It's that time again. Time to talk about a class in Final Fantasy XIV. Black Mage is probably the most Final Fantasy job in all of Final Fantasy. A poster child not just for Final Fantasy XIV, but for much of the entire series of Final Fantasy games. Black Mage has historically been one of the best maintained classes across all expansions. This is because it is the main class of the Lord himself, Naoki Yoshida. You can always tell that they have a clear vision when making this job every expansion. This is one of 3 selfish DPS in the game, meaning you don't bring anything else to your group other than the sheer amount of damage you can output. In other words, when you're tired of dealing decent damage and you want to really start obliterating everything in sight, that's when you pick up a selfish DPS like Black Mage. But all of that is pointless. I know the real reason why you wanted to level a Black Mage. Probably inspired by a certain anime character. Someone who's known for using fire and then possibly passing out after combat. I am of course referring to Avdol from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Yes, I am!
Something I never do in these videos is explain my credibility when making class guides. To be 100% clear, I am a samurai main at this point who used to be a scholar main. I might not get everything 100% right in these guides, but I can get pretty close to it. Even if I don't put hundreds of hours into each and every class, I do at least understand how they are supposed to work. When making these guides, I usually look up other resources to try to better understand how to play jobs properly, and then spend a while getting gameplay footage and share my experiences with common pitfalls. But holy moly, I am actually the worst Black Mage player on the entire planet. You have no idea how many times I was supposed to cast fire and just clicked every single button around it that wasn't fire. I mean, there's not even that many buttons to click in this rotation, but I have found new and creative ways to completely ruin my damage output. Thankfully, I do have a personal friend in my static who plays Black Mage and helped a tremendous amount when making this video. His name is Jalen, and he does have a YouTube channel called The Jalen, where he uploads videos of him dancing in Dance Evolution. Although he doesn't make Final Fantasy XIV content, he does frequently appear in my live streams. With that simple shout out of the way, on with the rest of the video. A concept that can be important to understand is the idea of skill floors and skill ceilings. This is something that can be applied in many games in general. A skill floor is the minimum amount of skill required to have a basic understanding of a class, and skill ceiling would be the amount of skill required to fully maximize a job. A good example of something with a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling would be the game Go. But people might be more familiar with something like chess. It's easy to learn how each of the pieces move in chess, which is the skill floor to play the game. But to be the best chess player in the world requires many, many hours of study and dedication to fully understand how the game works. Why I bring all of this up is that Black Mage is not hard to understand from an ability rotation standpoint. In fact, it might have one of the easiest rotations of all DPS classes. But in practice, it can be one of the hardest, if not the hardest job to play well in the entire game. This is why when you talk to people about this job, you might get 2 very different responses. Some people will say that this job is super easy because you don't have a million buttons and timers to keep track of, and others will say it's extremely difficult because to play Black Mage well will require tons of time investment into getting completely comfortable with the tools that you have at your disposal and a deep understanding of the content that you are running. TLDW, if the content that you are running is piss easy, then Black Mage is piss easy. If the content that you are running is hard, Black Mage makes that content feel exponentially harder. I wouldn't be intimidated by playing Black Mage, but if you plan to run savage content, you might end up dedicating your life to optimizing your gameplay. To begin this journey into optimization, Black Mage is one of the starting jobs. If you want to be a Black Mage from the very beginning, you're just going to start as a Thaumaturge, or unlock it from the Thaumaturge Guild in Ul'dah. This is when I say that leveling this class is like deciphering the Da Vinci Code. This trash will feel like a broken shell for an insanely long amount of time before it starts to make any sense whatsoever. There is a convoluted mess of skills that are useful and then immediately become useless, and a lack of overall cohesion until you get to a higher level. I once again do not really make these as leveling guides anymore, but here are some tips I can give you for some common pitfalls. Once you get Freeze, Blizzard 2 is garbage. Only keep it around if you think you're going to be synced below level 35. Spamming just Freeze is optimal for trash until you get Flare at level 50. Once you have Flare, you can now use Fire 2 again for trash packs before finishing them with Flare. Transpose is not needed for single target once you get Fire 3 and Blizzard 3, but it is necessary for AoE for a long time and is a way to save yourself if things get messed up. Getting comfortable with Astral Fire and Umbral Ice phases is important. Your goal is to always use as much fire as possible. Except optimizing low-level Black Mage damage is just such a disaster, given that I already told you that just freeze is optimal at some points, which goes against having a fire phase in the first place. I wouldn't worry too much about this because your goal once you're level 80 is to maximize fire phases, so it's best to just get that drilled into you from the start. If you are morbidly curious about what an actual optimized low-level damage rotation looks like, be prepared for it to change every 10 levels. Also, in between pulls, it's best to use Transpose to ensure that you have full mana. Now that everyone's level 80, it's time to clean up your hotbar and remove buttons that are of absolutely no use to you. I already mentioned to get rid of Blizzard 2, but regular old Blizzard should also never be used anymore either. Fire 2 is also worthless now, and Sleep was only ever useful for randomly sleeping a trash pack and making your tank confused, or in single player content where you need to fight one mob at a time. Sleep also has no purpose when running level 80 content, and Scathe is a piece of garbage that you should probably not have on your hotbar either. With that step out of the way, when going through trash and level 80 dungeons, your AoE rotation is pretty straightforward. You have two options with either a Toasty Flare or a Chilled Flare. The Chilled Flare is nice and easy, where you use Freeze, make sure to have Enochian up, and then you can slot a filler spell after that, usually something like Thunder 4 or Foul. If you have neither, just wait for mana. You then cast Flare twice, and now you're back at the start and cast Freeze. Yeah, that's it. It's really not that bad. If you want a hot Flare, the only difference is that you cast Fire 3, yes, the single target skill, before you cast these two flares. Crazy, I know. Both of these rotations have very comparable damage output, but Toasty Flare is slightly better if there are 3 to 4 enemies, and Chilled Flare is slightly better if there are 5 or more enemies. And using a single target rotation is best for 2 enemies or less. I'll explain abilities more in a bit, but I always tell everyone to use your AoE, and Black Mage's AoE rotation is not very hard to understand. And while in dungeons in between pulls, or while your tank is grouping all the mobs up, using Umbral Soul will allow you to build up Foul during downtime, and keep Enochian active as well. If you were still in Astral Fire after everything dies, don't panic, simply transpose so you can go back to pressing Umbral Soul. Alright, let's begin with some basics. You often hear about the ABCs of playing a DPS, which stands for always be casting. One thing you'll notice on Black Mage is that your cast times and your recast times will not always line up. For example, Fire 4 has a longer cast time than the recast time. I've explained the concept of GCD clipping before, but Black Mage will naturally clip its GCD just by existing. So rather than using the phrase keep the GCD spinning, I should say here to keep the GCD spinning as much as possible by always having something casting. Hilariously, White Mage and Black Mage both have a very similar dilemma, where you don't have many instant cast GCDs. In fact, on Black Mage, you have a single ability that is always an instant cast GCD, and that's Xenoglossy. That's right, your level 80 skill. Okay, I'm lying to you, Scathe does exist, but let's pretend like it doesn't. Thus, you don't have very many movement opportunities or many optimal places to spell weave. This is where Black Mage procs come into play. Whenever you use fire, yes, regular old fire, there is a chance to get a fire starter proc, which will make your next Fire 3 have no cast time and cost no mana. This proc lasts for 18 seconds. It is best to use this skill during your fire phase and not to transition back to Astral Fire from Umbral Ice. I will elaborate on this later. Your damage over time skill in the form of Thunder 3 also has a chance to give you a Thunder proc every time the damage ticks. This proc is very similar to Firestarter in the way that your next Thunder 3 will have no cast time and cost no mana, and the proc lasts for 18 seconds. Because of the lack of mana cost on these procs, you can quite literally use them pretty much whenever you want, with an asterisk. Once again, you should use Fire 3 during Astral Fire. Thus, the instant cast skills that you will usually have at your disposal are Fire 3, Thunder 3, and Xenoglossy. You should plan these cooldowns around when you need to move or when you need to weave. But wait, there's more. When transitioning to Fire or Ice phase by using Fire 3 or Blizzard 3, the spellcast will be significantly faster. This will give you enough time to weave a single skill in that slot as well. Thankfully, there are not many skills that you need to weave on this class, but the weavable skills are Sharp Cast, Triple Cast, Ley Lines, and Mana Font. But you also have your general spellcasting skills like Swift Cast and Sure Cast. No, I'm not going to talk about that one, at least not for a while. With some of these general concepts out of the way, it's time to talk about how to delicately face roll on your keyboard or controller. Okay, wait a second. I didn't have a good place to slide this into the video, so you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. If you subscribe to Misshapen Chair, you might occasionally be notified when I unload another dumpster fire of a video. I unfortunately have to continue to be aggressive with these self-promotion segments because they very much help the channel grow. If you want to help feed the demonic beast that is our mileage program, you can also do things such as liking the video, commenting on them, and sharing my stuff with friends, but especially enemies. I continue to appreciate all the support I have gotten, and may we all give up on cast times and become Bushido Masters. Alright, it's that time in the video where I talk about openers. Well, guess what? Openers on Black Mage are some of the most confusing part of this class. This is because what opener you should use, or I should say can use, is entirely dependent on your spell speed stat. I, for example, have around 2200 spell speed. I don't talk about stat priorities in these videos, but optimal Black Mages have a ton of spell speed. I am not geared to be an optimal Black Mage. So I'll give you the opener that I use for my spell speed tier, but I do have Jalen providing footage of an optimal opener for 3600 spell speed and above. I'm not going to recommend it this time, I am demanding that you look up what other openers look like on Black Mage because this is highly specific to whatever spell speed tier you fit into. I am only showing 2 of the 4 common openers that this class utilizes. I will link the balance guide in the description as a resource as it does include the other common openers. Alright, for myself who fits in the 1421 to 2500 spell speed tier, I'm using the No Blizzard 4 opener. Long before combat starts, assuming you're using a battle timer, cast Sharpcast 5 to 12 seconds before combat begins. We cast Blizzard 3 about 4 seconds before combat starts. We now clip our GCD to use Enochian. Now cast Thunder 3, which will proc thanks to Sharpcasting earlier. Cast Fire 3, which will be fast enough to weave triple cast. Use Fire 4. This will give you a weaving window where you could use a tincture if that's what you're doing, but I'm going to wait around like an idiot instead. Cast Fire 4 again and now weave Ley Lines. You should be able to get 3 more Fire 4 casts in before finishing Fire Phase with Despair. Now use that Thunder 3 proc, weave Mana Font, and you get to cast another Fire 4 and then a Despair thanks to the getting mana back. We finally cast Blizzard 3 to get into Ice Phase, and we can now cast Blizzard 4 and then Xenoglossy, which should be up by now. And you will now go into your typical rotation by casting Fire 3. If you are in the 3300 spell speed tier or more, here is the JP opener. Begin by precasting Sharpcast 12 seconds before combat starts. Precast Fire 3 about 4 seconds before combat starts. An easy trick for ensuring proper timings is to use Fire 3 8 seconds after using Sharpcast. Use Enochian and then cast Thunder 3. Cast Fire 4 and weave triple cast. Cast Fire 4 again and weave Ley Lines. Cast Fire 4 again, cast another Fire 4 and weave Swift Cast so you can now cast Despair. Weave Mana Font and cast Fire 4 and then cast Despair one last time. You can now cast Blizzard 3 and weave Sharpcast. Use your Thunder 3 proc and use Blizzard 4. You are now going into your typical rotation by casting Fire 3. Now that you have seen what a couple of the openers look like, welcome to the damage rotation. With nothing fancy, I'll start with Ice Phase. Ideally, when you have 0 mana, you cast Blizzard 3. Assuming you're coming out of Fire Phase, remember that you can single weave after this Blizzard 3 cast. You are now in Umbral Ice Phase, and technically you have 2 filler spells here, but you should probably cast Blizzard 4 for one of those fillers to be able to cast more Fire 4 in your next Fire Phase. You will certainly have a single filler slot here, so you can usually either refresh Thunder if you need to, or just cast Xenoglossy. If neither of these options are available to you for this moment, then waiting for full mana is usually ideal instead of just casting something random. This is because we want to spend as little time in Umbral Ice as possible. Being an Ice Mage is not good. But while skills like Thunder and Xenoglossy can technically fit anywhere in your rotation, you usually have a filler slot here for these skills anyways. When you have max mana, or I should say close to it, if you casted Thunder 3 and went down to 9600, you can still cast Fire 3. Once again, you can single weave after this Fire 3 cast. Cast Fire 4 3 times. Now you cast Fire to refresh Astral Fire and not drop Enochian. Then cast Fire 4 3 more times and cast Despair. You should now have 0 mana and then cast Blizzard 3 and the cycle continues. Yeah, the rotation is really not that bad. It is very simple. However, let me explain how this rotation can become a little bit varied. As an example, if you have a Thunder proc, you can use it at any time. It's best to use the Thunder proc before it runs out, even if your dot is still ticking on the boss. In addition, you can refresh Thunder at any time during your rotation, even if it requires a hard cast during Fire Phase. Just remember that it doesn't refresh Astral Fire, so pay attention to that timer. Also, if you were at 9600 mana going into your Fire Phase, hard casting Thunder while in that Fire Phase will screw up your mana, so avoid doing that. For the spell speed that I'm at, which is about 2200, I find myself having no issue refreshing Thunder and casting 3 Fire 4s before needing to cast Fire. But this is pretty spell speed dependent. Also, you might just use a proc like Thunder or Fire for movement during a mechanic in a fight. Thankfully, a Fire proc will let you refresh Astral Fire while still being an instant cast. When you're at level 80, if you have a Fire proc, it is best to use it during Fire Phase because it deals significantly more damage. If you use your instant cast Fire 3 to transition from Umbral Ice to Astral Fire, the Astral Fire timer will tick down slightly faster than what you might be used to. This isn't actually faster, it's just that the countdown started earlier than if you had casted Fire 3. This can randomly throw off your groove, so if you have a Fire proc, just toss it in somewhere before you cast Blizzard 3. Similarly, if you use a Fire proc in the middle of your Fire Phase for movement, if you haven't casted one of the 3 Fire 4s in a row yet, you might have less time to cast those before Astral Fire runs out than you are used to. This usually isn't a combo breaker, but it is something that you should have in the back of your mind, because it might make you overconfident in how much time you have to cast something like Despair. What I should mention is that your goal is to always cast as much Fire 4 as possible. You should be able to get 6 casts of Fire 4 per Fire Phase, but at the same time, don't drop a Nokian. Obviously though, I am a master at dropping a Nokian, so let me explain how to recover. If you drop Astral Fire, or technically Umbral Ice, but I find that to happen very rarely, then you will need to know the recovery combo, also known as the "Are you fucking kidding me" combo. First, you cast Freeze. Yes, you heard me right, you cast your AoE skill on single target. This is because Freeze has a fast cast time and lets you get Umbral Ice 3 and gives you a single Umbral Heart. Immediately use a Nokian to get it back. If Thunder has fallen off, you can use that here as well. Then you cast Fire 3, and you should be able to get in 5 Fire 4s in total during this recovery Fire Phase. Although knowing how to recover is important, it is also important to never do this. If you find yourself consistently dropping a segment in a fight, you should figure out what you need to do to avoid dropping. Obviously though, mistakes can still happen, especially if you are new to content. So this is the most important thing to know how to do that you should avoid at all costs. Or you can be like me and get lots of practice with learning how to recover. So now I'll explain how not to drop and how to continue your casting onslaught. It's time to talk about slide casting. Slide casting is an intentional game mechanic, although it can be viewed as an exploit, where spells are considered to be casted before the actual cast time ends. This is used as a way to compensate for playing in a high ping environment. So when you can start moving for a slide cast is entirely dependent on what kind of hardware you are using, your internet connection, and your distance from the data center. So if you're playing on a fully loaded gaming PC with a hardwired internet and you live in the basement of the building that the data center is hosted in, you can probably slidecast earlier than someone who is managing to still somehow be playing on a PlayStation 3 despite support being dropped for it, with a lemon for a router on a dial-up connection. So what I'm going to say here is, practicing on a dummy and seeing how much time you get where you can move and the spellcast still goes off can help you get an idea of what your setup will allow you to do. On average, you can slide cast about a half second before the cast time ends. Keep in mind though, if your internet is shaky with inconsistent ping, you might have high variance for when you can actually get a slide cast in. Slide casting should be used for 2 things in practice: finishing a spellcast right before a movement section, or for very minute movement changes where you can still dodge a mechanic entirely. Slide casting and then hard casting another skill right after it will usually clip your GCD ever so slightly. But if you string an instant cast spell after the slide cast, you can keep the GCD spinning. This potential extra half second of movement can prevent you from needing to cast multiple instant cast GCDs while moving to preserve uptime, as well as barely clip your GCD to avoid mechanics. However, I should say, canceling a spell cast to not die is better than trying as hard as possible to slide cast. Dying is always the worst thing that can happen to your damage. Slide casting is entirely a comfort thing. The more you practice this, the better feeling you will get for when you can finish a cast and still be successful. As a note, you can even slide cast things like teleporting to Aetherites and using consumables. This has no practical application other than swag points when teleporting around the universe of Final Fantasy XIV. And if you play on high ping, you might not be able to slide cast at all. It is not the be-all end-all for being the best Black Mage player in the universe, but it is another tool that you have at your disposal to preserve your GCD spin cycles. Outside of slide casting, if you need to move, using an instant cast and then weaving swift cast right after it will give you an instant cast GCD without having to waste additional cooldowns that you might want to preserve. Great for stuff like not dropping fire. Triple cast can also just let you continue your rotation as normal for 3 GCDs. And while it won't increase your damage output if you have to clip your GCD to cast it, casting spells during a movement section is better than not casting at all. Using a Thunder proc purely for movement, even if it's not refreshing the dot optimally, is still better than dropping your GCD. And as usual, just remember that using Fire 3 and using Swift Cast for Fire will make your timer for Astral Fire feel like it ends a little bit faster. Now, Scathe is technically an instant cast GCD that you can use whenever you want. But it will not only ruin your mana, it also does such pathetic damage and eats your sharp cast casually. This skill sucks so much that you should never use it. Ever. Waiting to be able to cast normally again is better than casting Scathe 99 out of 100 times. You could remove it from your hotbar entirely and you wouldn't be any worse off. The only thing I haven't talked about yet is that you get 2 charges of Xenoglossy that you can hold at a time. You will still start charging up the third one while you're holding 2 charges, but if the gauge fills up completely and you already have 2 stacks, you won't gain any more. So never overcap this skill, and if you want to optimize your damage further, saving Xenoglossy for when you have raid buffs up or tinctures come back up is always more optimal. The only other trick I haven't mentioned is your movement skill. Ethereal Manipulation will slide you to a party member. Just remember that you slide to them because it won't let you teleport across death planes. This is a great lazy tool if your party is already pre-positioned for a mechanic. You want to weave this skill after an instant cast GCD to not lose uptime, and keep in mind the time it takes to get to the player that you rush to is also dependent on all the same hardware factors that affect slide casting, in addition to how far away you are from your target. And similarly, Between the Lines will do the exact same thing but bring you back to your Ley Lines. Speaking of which, Ley Lines lets you cast 15% faster while standing in them. Ideally, you want to position this in such a way that you won't have to leave them for mechanics, or hold the cooldown for a little bit if there's something that you need to see first in a fight to know where a good ley line placement is. Keep in mind, it is always better to simply cast ley lines even if you don't get full uptime with it than holding the cooldown for so long that you miss out on an additional ley line cast that you could have gotten in a fight otherwise. This is also something that's entirely fight dependent, so if you're new to something, get ready to say goodbye to those ley lines until you know when and where you should properly use them. We are finally at the cooldown tracker part of the video. Every clip GCD on Black Mage is a loss of about 150 potency, although something like clipping for Sharp Cast will still be an overall DPS increase. Speaking of which, you get Sharp Cast every 30 seconds. Ideally use it to get a proc on Thunder, but if it's up, getting a fire proc is also fine. Triple Cast comes up every 60 seconds and will increase your damage output if you properly weave it, not if you clip your GCD for it. It's best to use it right after Fire 3 to get 3 instant casts of Fire 4. Ley Lines comes up every 90 seconds. Once again, try to weave it, but it is still an overall DPS increase even if you clip for it. And finally, Mana Font comes up every 180 seconds. Use this at the end of a fire phase when you have 0 mana to be able to cast another Fire 4 and a Despair. And that's everything you need to keep track of for damage. I am also going to mention other utility that you have at your disposal. Surecast will prevent most knockback effects. Great to use so that your spellcasts don't get interrupted by certain mechanics. Mana Ward will shield you for 30% of your max HP. This doesn't usually have to be used unless you are in a very bad spot. It might end up saving your life. But I don't recommend consistently using this to tank AoEs. You should always try to pre-position for mechanics or just save your healer's sanity. Addle is a debuff that works on bosses to make them deal less magic damage. This is the only utility that Black Mage brings to the party, and can help with heavy-hitting raid-wide attacks and high-end content. And finally, Umbral Soul is your downtime skill when in between pulls in dungeons, as well as something that you should do if the boss decides to run away for a minute. If you are in fire phase and the boss pieces out on you, that is when you can transpose and start clicking Umbral Soul again. And the final ultimate skill in the universe, Lucid Dreaming, is useless. outside of a very niche optimization that you can technically do involving transpose. I am not going to talk about that in this video because it is weird to execute and is also generally frowned upon. This concludes everything I wanted to talk about on Black Mage. This job is actually not hard to pick up, but it's extremely hard to be good at. You will have to have a very solid understanding of the ins and outs of fights to be able to fully utilize this class. This is not something that people generally like taking into high-end content when learning it, but I too enjoy suffering. It's honestly one of the best classes to pick up because of its low skill requirement for entry, but also rewarding players for dedicating more time to it. It also really makes you appreciate how fortunate every other class in the game is with their plethora of movement options. Despite losing my sanity with dropping Enochian, Black Mage is probably one of the most satisfying classes to play in the game for me. Because once you nail everything in a fight, plan all of your cooldowns correctly, get full Ley Lines uptime, don't drop Enochian, never clip your GCD, don't die, and even crit on everything for some reason, you're still going to get out-damaged by a freestyle samurai in your party. Now let's get out there and practice that recovery combo.